We are at the verge of the abyss.
A dire warning from the United Nations chief amid a gathering of world leaders calling for tougher action on climate change. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The United States played host to the Leaders' Summit on Climate on Thursday as the nation seeks to reassert itself as a global leader on climate action.
The United States sets out on the road to cut greenhouse gases in half by the end of this decade. That's where we're headed as a nation.
China, the world's biggest emitter, announced an ambitious target of its own, vowing to curb carbon emissions by 2060.
China will strive to peak carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. China has committed to move from carbon peak to carbon neutrality in a much shorter time span than what might take many developed countries, and that requires extraordinarily hard efforts from China.
Earlier, I spoke with Jared Blumenfeld. He is California's Secretary for Environmental Protection. I asked him what he thought of Chinese President Xi Jinping's comments.
I mean, that was really inspiring to hear from President Xi just now. You know, we are, as you said, all in this together, and I think there's a lot of momentum building around the world. And President Biden coming in today, having the commitment of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030 is really aggressive. It's like twice the goal that President Obama had. And I think, you know, China, India, the European Union, the United States, all these big superpowers coming together and recognizing that through innovation and collaboration, we can tackle this issue and boost our economic output is huge. There was also a report today talking about the huge cost if we don't take action on climate change. So I think the paradigm has shifted so that people are realizing, one, this is an existential crisis. It involves our livability, habitability on the planet. And secondly, they're big opportunities if we do this right. And I think, you know, we look to China for things like the expansion of electric vehicles, incredible amount of work happening there, renewable energy all the way through the work on things like high-speed rail has really, I think, inspired us in California and the rest of the world to think what is possible. So we hope that we can work and continue to work with China on issues of carbon trading that we've been engaged in, of really thinking about how we decarbonize our electricity sector. California has some very ambitious goals, and already about 60% of our energy is carbon free. So we have a lot to learn and we have a lot to share, and I think that's the beauty of Earth Day.
What about green technology? China has, of course, taken the lead in developing these industries, green technology industries. What kind of cooperation is there between California and China on these technologies?
Well, a lot of them actually are based in both places. If you look like an electric vehicle company like NIO, that's a competitor to Tesla, they're in Silicon Valley. They're also in Shanghai and Beijing, and really a growth company. So many of these, you know, we're all on the Pacific Rim. I think there's a lot of great exchange of ideas. California's always been that place, that melting pot that really faces towards Asia and China. And so that's what we need. We need innovators coming together, irrespective of where they are, and building on each other's ideas so that we can have new liquid fuels that are based on algae. We can have more efficient production of hydrogen through solar. We can think about how we transform plastics. You know, there's now innovations of how plastics can be eaten by microbes and worms. And I mean, there's such brilliant people out there. And those people, you know, are collaborating every day virtually, like we all have been through COVID. So there's actually probably a silver lining of all this technology that allows us to communicate that we've used in the last year. We need to keep that going between California and China, and we intend to.
Now, specifically looking at California's efforts to combat climate change, it goes back a long way. It goes back to 2006, when was the passage of the Global Warming Solutions Act, and that was extended and strengthened 10 years later in 2016. And what kinds of outcomes are you seeing?
So actually, just to go back even further, it actually goes back to 1965 and Ronald Reagan. LA, you couldn't breathe. So it actually started as a movement to clean the air. And I know many cities in China are facing the same struggles. And that's also a partnership, like thinking about how we reduce air pollution also can help us in the case of an electric vehicle. Think about how we reduce carbon pollution. So they're the same, they're different sides of the same coin. And really California's ahead of the game because unfortunately we had such bad air pollution in the 1960s. But in the last 2 decades, we've had, unlike the rest of the nation, we've had a Republican governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and then Jerry Brown, and then Gavin Newsom, 3 governors that all had back-to-back commitments. And I think that's what you see as a benefit of California. Whether you're Republican or Democrat, you care about climate change, you're going to take action on climate change. And we've seen a lot of progress on renewable energy. You know, the majority of the utility scale solar projects, the very large solar projects, are because California energy companies are being pushed by government to only buy contracts for renewable energy. Our #1 export now is electric vehicles. We have 34 electric vehicle manufacturers in our state. We have hundreds of thousands of clean, green energy jobs, about 5 to 1 with fossil fuels. So when people think about the transition from fossil fuel energy to the future, California really represents that. We have good, high-paying jobs that represent the future, and those old jobs people are leaving to join the new economy, whether it's energy efficiency or looking at how we clean up our hazardous waste facilities. You know, we're really pushing to make sure employment's a big aspect of it. We also, unfortunately, yesterday had to announce that we're in a drought emergency. Last year was the hottest year on record in the entire record books in Death Valley, and we had the worst wildfire season by far. So California is spending billions of dollars to combat climate change. It's here right now, as people know around the world. But in China, we're getting more flooding, more heat waves, more wildfires, and all those things are contributing to us having to spend billions and billions of dollars. So Californians are feeling the impacts of climate change, and we're taking action on climate change. We last September, the governor Newsom came out with a landmark accord to push forward that all vehicles sold after 2035 be 100% zero-emission vehicles. And now, actually, we saw Thailand replicate that today, but many other jurisdictions have pushed. So this is about upping our ambition and then showing how we can implement and sharing those stories across the globe. And we've had a long, all the way back in 2006, starting to now, we've had a really good collaborative relationship with the Ministry of Environment in China. We have a MOU that we are anticipating signing soon, and lots of other activities that we're engaged in with the Chinese government. And through those collaborations, we all learn more.
Now, as you said, there has been a focus on air quality in California, but you've also seen the impact of climate change in other ways. The impact from wildfires, for instance, has grown more and more year after year. In fact, Scientific American, the magazine, published an article which said, "The science is clear. Climate change plays an undeniable role in the unprecedented wildfires in recent years." Do you get the sense that there is a recognition, not just in California, but in the country, on the risks and the challenges ahead that is posed by climate change?
Yeah, I remember waking up in San Francisco. The sky was bright orange, bright orange. I mean, it felt like a Mad Max movie or a post-apocalyptic movie. And it went on for a full 2 days. Those images were blasted around the world. They were the result of wildfires that we had in the state that that we are spending billions of dollars cleaning up this year the impacts of those fires. And yes, it's undeniable. We're feeling the realities of climate change, and I think that's influencing public opinion, not just here in California, but throughout the United States. You see those numbers in public opinion surveys changing. You see the emphasis that President Biden is now putting on climate change. In large part, it's because the country, I think, has moved significantly, and that's important. We need public support for all these efforts, but we also need recognition that this isn't just about sacrifice. This is also about opportunity to think about how we take a leadership role in manufacturing, as you pointed out, in innovation, all those things. Countries that don't do that, I think, are going to feel left behind, and we want to make sure that within the United States, within California, this concept of environmental justice, which is that poorer communities, particularly communities of color, are not left behind in the clean energy and clean technology revolution. And that's something I think you heard from a lot of speakers today at Biden's climate summit.
Now, of course, making the commitments is one thing. The other is carrying them out, implementing them. Are you confident right now that they will be implemented? I mean, one of the things that President Biden has done, he did very quickly after coming to office, and that was rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. But are you confident that this will happen?
Yeah, as you say, it's all about the implementation, and words are important, but the deeds that follow up on them are much more important. And that's actually where California and states come in. The United States is a collection of 50 states, and the work really needs to be done in every town, by every business, by every state and state capital. And so a lot of the way that laws evolve in the United States is they get set at the national level, but then we have to implement them at the state and local level. So we're ready, our sleeves are rolled up, we're ready to take those actions, and in some cases, the Biden administration's even pushing California to think about how we can do things more and better, and that's good for us. This is like a relay race. We don't, sometimes we're in front, but we're often being passed that leadership baton by others, whether it's China or the federal government, and we welcome that. We welcome the challenge of moving forward on climate aggressively because we have to.
You know, as you point out, these are 50 states, and as I pointed out, California has taken the lead in U.S. efforts to fight climate change. But what about other states in the country? You know, to be successful, all states have to pull in the same direction. What, in your opinion, has California done that has done right, I should say, that can be implemented in other states as well?
So there's a lot. We just sent a letter to President Biden, Governor Newsom, and 11 other governors. It was bipartisan. We had Republican governors and Democratic, from everyone from New York to Massachusetts to California and Washington and Oregon, saying that we need to implement a national clean car rule that will push for all new vehicles sold to be electric by 2035. So that's an example. What we do on our transportation policy is incredibly important in the state. How we think about setting targets for when we achieve 100% renewable energy. California has done that for 2045. The federal government's now said, let's up that ante and try and get there by 2035. Those are important goals. Thinking about how we build new homes and energy efficiency is something that each state can do. How we think about mobility and even the return to work and our evolution as we think about moving out of COVID. How do we use these technologies like the one we're using today so that people aren't commuting to work day in, day out? How do we think about jobs and retraining, what we call in the United States the just transition? If you're in coal or oil production, how do you move to a place where we can make a job for you in the future? And some of those are going to be cleaning up oil fields. There's a lot of oil field remediation that needs to be done. So the point is there's a lot of great policies that come from the states, each of the states. We steal all their good ones, they steal ours, and that's the way that good policy happens.
Mr. Secretary, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, for more now on the Leaders Summit on Climate, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Arlington, Virginia, Changhua Wu is Executive Director of the Professional Association for China's Environment. Barbara Finamore is a Senior Visiting Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies. She joins us from Londonderry, New Hampshire. And with us here in Washington, D.C., Sweta Chakraborty is a risk and behavioral scientist. Welcome to all of you. Barbara, let me start with you. The summit, the Biden summit, has been convened. It's a very impressive turnout. We heard from leaders across the world today. But as we just heard from the California Secretary of the Environment, it's the implementation of these proposals that is the challenge. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I think that's right. Targets are the first step. And the Biden administration has just announced the most ambitious targets in the history of the United States. But targets are only the first step, and it needs concrete actions in order to implement them. The executive orders that Biden has already issued, the Job Act that he has proposed in Congress, they include a whole range of activities that the United States, the Biden administration, intends to take action on. But it takes time to come up with the detailed, concrete actions that need to be done. And the same is true for China with its ambitious carbon neutrality and carbon peaking goals. And the 14th five-year plan has certain details, but a lot more details need to be worked out. And I was very glad to see that in the joint statement by the United States and China on climate that was recently announced, both countries recognize the need to work together on near-term concrete actions that will enable them to achieve these ambitious goals.
Changhua Wu, let's look a little bit closer at what China has been doing. The Chinese President, Xi Jinping, he has pledged to strictly control the use of coal for energy in China's current five-year plan. And in his words, China would phase it down in the next 5 years. How far will this go towards China meeting its goal of cutting emissions, of getting to neutral by 2060?
Coal is a major piece of the puzzle in the Chinese energy transition process. That's why the president is emphasizing single out coal issue in particular at this climate summit today. And so currently coal continues to account a little bit more than half of the energy structure in China. And so as the president committed, and now we set this peaking targets, before 2030 and carbon neutrality before 2060. In that context, the first thing first, we have to address this particular piece of the puzzle, which is the core piece of the puzzle, which is coal burning. So the current commitment or actions actually, on one side, we've been retiring as much as possible the existing coal-fired power plant fleets, even though many of them were not really old enough, actually. They were not running out of their lifetime, but Chinese government has decided to retire them. In the meantime, actually, the government has been aggressively developing renewable energy, particularly wind and solar. Of course, in that context, the government is deploying the technology to capture energy efficiency as much as possible to make sure we do not really consume as much energy as we've been doing so. So put all the pieces together. So this is President committed, and China is aiming to cap coal consumption probably within the next couple of years, if possible. So that will be able to really achieve carbon peaking before 2030.
Sweta, great to have you back with us. With the prospect of rising sea levels, especially in countries in the developing world, these countries are especially vulnerable. They get hit both ways. One is they're facing the prospect of rising sea levels. On the other hand, they're also low-income countries. They don't have the kind of money that developed countries have to fight climate change. This was something that the leader, the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina, spoke about at the summit. This is what she had to say. Let's listen.
Despite being a climate vulnerable country with resource constraints, Bangladesh has emerged as a global leader on adaptation and mitigation. We are spending on an average $5 billion, about 2.5% of our GDP, on climate adaptation and resilience building measures.
So, Sweta, this is a matter of urgency for these countries. Give us a sense, or perspective rather, of the challenges that they face.
Well, we saw an alliance form across these states that are exceptionally vulnerable, and it's those that are really low-lying and those that are closer to, in the lower latitudes and closer to the equator, that will be seeing prolonged heat, making it unsafe for people to be outside, whether it's for work or their livelihoods in some capacity. It's a human health issue at that point. And so there's an alliance that has formed to really recognize that, and we saw them come together at the last meeting of the parties. And it's going to be really critical to hear their voices coming up at this next COP26 in Glasgow at the end of this year. And it's because of their vulnerability. The national sovereignties of island states especially is exceptionally more vulnerable than a lot of parts of the world that will feel the impacts of climate change. Nobody will be immune to this, but there will be those who experience it sooner than later. And those are the voices that we really need to elevate and listen to, because ultimately those will be the populations that will result in a global redistribution of where people actually live and set up their livelihoods. If places on the planet are no longer habitable, people are not going to stay there. There's no such thing as people just staying put. They will migrate. And so human migrations will pick up in intensity, frequency, and we will see these migrations happening more simultaneously, whether we're talking about these island states or those in the lower latitudes or Central Africa or Central America. These are particularly vulnerable areas of the planet that we need to keep our eye on and we really need to listen to.
Right, and Sweta, I would imagine that with that kind of migration that you're talking about, there will be a competition for resources.
Right, and we have to remember that this planet does not have finite resources, and that is something that we constructed, was consumption at the levels that we're seeing them now, that is getting us into this point where we have to increase food production by 70% to feed 10 billion people on the planet by 2050 because of consumption patterns of the West and these Western democracies that have really led this type of growth and demand for continued resource development. But it doesn't mean that it's being replenished fast enough to really make sense. And so recognizing the fact that we don't have an alternative to this one planet, and this planet we've never existed on at this temperature point, means that we really need to reconstruct how we interact with the planet and what that means for our consumption going forward as a collective.
Right, Barbara, if we look at the issue of cost, I mean, almost every single country in the world has been hit very hard by the pandemic, and that puts extra pressure on them now to combat climate change. It is something that the South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa, talked about at the summit. This is what he said. Let's listen.
It is important that aid on climate change should be provided separately and should not be part of conventional development assistance. When it is given in the form of loan financing, the debt burden of developing countries is worsened. We call on developed economies, which historically bear the greatest responsibility for emissions, to meet their responsibilities to developing economies.
So, Barbara, how big a challenge is that? I mean, are there plans in place to help financially help these countries?
Yes. President Biden today at the climate summit also announced an international climate finance plan that recognizes that the United States has fallen behind in its development climate finance assistance during the last few years. And so I was pleased to see that Biden committed to doubling U.S. public finance to developing countries on climate by 2024. And as part of that package, to triple its assistance to developing countries for adapting to the impacts of climate change that we just heard so much about. So this is really important. Scaling up finance for clean energy, for green transitions is incredibly important. It's also really important to scale back and eliminate funding for fossil fuel infrastructure. We heard South Korea today announce that it was going to end financing of coal plants overseas. And we hope that that will be followed by other countries, including China. We're already seeing evidence that China is beginning that transition to providing renewable energy financing and support to developing countries on the Belt and Road. In fact, last year, more financing was provided to Belt and Road countries by China on renewable energy than for clean coal. And we hope that this trend will continue and that green investment principles will be followed going forward. This is an area, again, where I think that the United States and China can work together to help these developing countries through increased finance make that green transition.
Okay, Changhua, we've just got a little bit of time left. These pledges that were made at the summit are non-binding. Do they need some kind of enforcement mechanism so that, well, if only to measure progress in the years ahead?
Yes, they do. The Paris Agreement is the multilateral climate governance vehicle, and with all the countries now, US back to the Paris Agreement as well. So that's going to be the international vehicle that countries will put them so-called NDC, nationally determined commitments, into that process so that there will be countries' commitment will be held accountable.
Sweta, President Biden, he pledged, as Barbara pointed out earlier on, very ambitious pledge, to halve US greenhouse gases by 2030. Is that too ambitious? Can it be done?
It can absolutely be done. If we look at this infrastructure bill, and there's other avenues to reaching these goals as well, but if this is implemented in the way that it's hoped to be, then we can get to 70 to 80% of it just from the bill and from rethinking how we produce electricity in this country. Between those two things, we can definitely meet these targets, and then we're well on our way to getting to net neutral by 2050.
Barbara, very quickly, the next big international climate summit, of course, is COP26. That's going to be held in Glasgow in Scotland in November. What are expectations for that summit?
Well, under the terms of the Paris Agreement, every signatory country has agreed to scale up their ambition and to enhance their official climate pledges. We've seen several countries do that today, but there's many, many more that need to come up with enhanced nationally determined contributions to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius increase and to aim for the 1.5 target. It can't do that without stronger pledges from every signatory country.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.